First of all, the title has changed a little. Things move so quickly.
Well, there you go.
Things are moving so quickly. I'm still going to talk about the reactions to the guide to the plan, and I think this is kind of partly motivated by how people watched, some of us in horror, at some of the reactions to the guide when it was first released. And we started to think about whether or not those reactions could have been forecast, firstly, and secondly, could have been reacted to in a more positive way by the proponents of the policy. And so, as Quentin mentioned this morning, economists are being asked to move beyond their comfort level in lots of ways, and we need to be considering ecology and sociology and other matters like that. And so this paper really is an attempt to go beyond our comfort zone and to think a little bit about the rhetoric that accompanied the release to the guide. So we decided to look at the public debate. So I'm a little worried that I'm not going to get through all of this, so I'm not so sure that this outline will I'll exactly follow this outline. Some policy background I'll skip through, and then I'm going to look at Hirschman's typology of reactionary rhetoric, which is a bit of a mouthful. I don't know that I'll get to the counter-arguments of the progressives or the people who were kind of proposing the policy, and then some concluding remarks. I won't go into the background too much either, since because of the politics. We've heard some of this background already, but I do think it's very interesting that the whole idea behind setting up a separate entity in the Murray-Darling Basin Authority was to remove the politics from water. In fact, according to John Howard, decisions about water resources in the Murray-Darling Basin all too often reflected parochial interests and did not reflect the best interests of the basin as a whole. He also noted that consensus-based decision-making had meant that difficult decisions were often avoided or delayed. So I think we need to keep all of that in mind. Okay, so as we've seen this morning on Quentin's presentation, the response to the guide was pretty amazing. Vocal dissent, burning of the guides, and there were some very angry meetings in rural centres. Basically, irrigation lobbyists were arguing that the reductions in water were too severe, and also that the flow-on effects to the wider community were going to be calamitous. Their solution, not surprisingly, was to invest even more in water use efficiency measures, and also to revise the sustainable diversion limits downwards. This also, in part, demonstrates what we were also talking about this morning about the scientist's error, what we heard about this morning, the scientist's error in thinking, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, for example, in thinking that we could ever substitute science, use science or appeal to science without necessarily going into the explanations behind that. Okay, so Hirschman's rhetoric of reaction is a theory that believes that all major policy reforms follow a pattern of rhetoric which characterises the interaction between the advocates for a policy on one hand and the opponents to change on the other. Now, in this case, we use the term reactionary not in a derogatory way, but rather in the way that Hirschman uses in terms of the people who are responding to some sort of policy reform. Now, this typology has not gone without criticism in part because it's really a fairly simple typology, but nonetheless we'll press on. So basically Hirschman's idea is that there's a predictable pattern that opponents of a policy use, and we try to apply this to some of the debate that we've heard around the guide. So the first type of response of opponents is the perversity thesis. The perversity thesis tells us that a policy rests on this idea that a policy change will not just fall short of the chosen objective and not just simply produce some negative spin-offs, but rather that it will send society in a direction that is the opposite of the intention of the policy. So the appeal of this as a tool of argument is that it doesn't really dismiss the need for reform per se, but rather it is intended to sabotage the cause for change. So, did the opponents to the guide employ this method? Well, I think we can see that a lot of the reaction is an attempt to intertwine the role of agriculture and the preservation or enhancement of ecological assets. In other words, to reduce water for agriculture, it was argued, is tantamount to decreasing the capacity of landholders to care for the environment. If we look, for example, at speeches by the National Farmers Federation, I'll just read some small excerpt from that speech by Ben Fargo. A productive agricultural base is also good for the environment. Our farmers own and manage about 55% of the continent. Over 94% of Australian farmers actively engage in natural resource management as a matter of course and plant over 20 million trees a year purely for conservation purposes. They are fully in tune with the environment around them and upon which they, their families and businesses rely. Okay, so moving on to the futility thesis, this is based on the idea that the attempted change is abortive. So any change is only going to be some sort of a cosmetic change. It's often tied to the belief in the authority of science. However, in this case, there's an irony in so much as it's been the absence of absolutes in terms of the science that irrigation lobbyists have in particular seized upon to argue against the changes. So, for example, Andrew Gregson talked about the estimates of employment losses as a result of the reductions not passing the bullshit test. So there's also been discussion around the fact that the ecology or the actual the ecological science is also not definite. Sorry, I'm trying to rush here. So reformists have actually added strength to this reactionary argument by acknowledging the incompletenesses of the science. And there's a quote there talking about the lack of understanding. The next thesis that can be used is the jeopardy thesis, which asserts that a proposed change, although perhaps desirable in itself, involves unacceptable losses in other areas. This type of argument focuses on a zero-sum game. In this case, two earlier achievements, or what's been seen as two earlier policy achievements, food security and regional development, are seen as being threatened by the new sustainable diversion limits. The Irrigators Council has consistently claimed that the policy will cost thousands of jobs, force food prices up and threaten family farms. And you can see the sorts of rhetoric that are used there. In addition, the growth of agriculture, the spread of agriculture and the growth of regional communities is also clearly portrayed as an achievement of the past that is also going to be jeopardised in the future. In this regard, reactionaries have sought to portray themselves in a sense as reformists, in so much as their concerns about the reallocation of water away from local irrigators are presented as a challenge to an important global policy perspective. I was going to go on with the...
I'll give you another couple of minutes over soon.
I think...
Bit of extra time, so it's okay.
Okay. All right, so just quickly to look at some of the responses by the progressives. The first of these is the imminent danger synergy illusion. In contrast to the zero-sum approach of the reactionaries, reformists typically counter with the possibility of a harmonious reform that will benefit not just one area but other areas as well. For example, John Quiggins' idea of an alternative adjustment mechanism in terms of community infrastructure is a good example of this kind of synergistic approach. However, that kind of suggestion has been countered once again by Gregson with statements such as this. Another approach of reformists is to focus on imminent danger, presented as if the harm that's going to be created by not changing is entirely certain and escapable. In this case, the Australian Conservation Foundation has, in a number of different media, talked about the calamitous results that will attend inaction. The cost of doing nothing would be unacceptable to everyone, and the Basin Plan will offer a historic nation-building opportunity to correct past mistakes and to plan for the future. The next tactic that can be applied by the reformist is the futility of resistance thesis, and this is the notion that there are some inexorable forces that prevent a policy from achieving its desired reform. So, for example, the concept that regional communities have always adapted, that regional centres are made of adaptive people, and that this won't be so calamitous. So we talk there about a shared vision and a clear understanding. Desperate predicament thesis. Policy advocates counter the perversity arguments with a desperate predicament response, that is, that change must occur at any cost. And once again, the Australian Conservation Council has also argued that we shouldn't be looking to a reduction of 3,000 to 4,000 gigalitres, that it in fact should be much, much higher than that. So this has been really quite a preliminary attempt to analyse some of the rhetoric that has surrounded the release of the guide. What has seemed to be the case is that the reformist arguments, whilst the farm lobbies and irrigation lobbyists have been quick to respond and well organised and very vocal, the reformist counter-arguments have been slow to emerge and relatively muted, so that they appear to have been taken by surprise by the extent of the response. And there has been a propensity, I think, in thinking about the communication of this policy to rely on science as the answer, or to rely on science to provide the argument or the case for change. Thank you.